So today's lecture is on Microsoft Expression Blend. So up to this point, we've had to create all of our user interfaces in Visual Studio. Now Visual Studio is great and it can get you most of the way there. However, if you really need an environment that you just want to work with the user interface and really make it professional looking, then Expression Blend, that's what it was created for. Now in the past, Microsoft created a whole suite of what was called the Expression Suite, and there was Microsoft Blend and there was some Expression other programs that you could that were like kind of like Adobe Illustrator. And now you get Blend for Visual Studio as the latest project or the latest application when you install Visual Studio Enterprise 2015 or other versions of Visual Studio. And so this application here, what's called Blend, is what a designer would use to create the data templates, for instance, that we've worked with, to create styles, those sort of things, so that it can really add that professional look to it. Now, that's the power of WPF, is that you can work on the back end, all the business logic, all of the code, and because there's that Zamel file and then the code behind file that are two completely separate files, they can work with the Zamel file and you can work with the .cs files. Then you can end up combining them in the end. So this is the application we're going to be working with today, is how to really work with your UI and where a designer would work. So I've opened up Blend for Visual Studio. And you're going to notice that a lot of things are extremely similar to Visual Studio. So you click File, New Project. We're going to do a WPF application. Click OK. Now, the thing to remember is that this is just a regular WPF application here. So you'll notice it's the exact same format, the same files, everything in here. I can also edit in Visual Studio if I want to. And typically the way you do these things is that you would write anything with your UI here in Blend, and then any of your like your button clicks, any of the code behind you needed to code real fast, you would actually do that in Visual Studio. This has a code editor which you can do for simple things. However, it's just not going to work as well as Visual Studio. So if you have to do any real coding, just jump over to Visual Studio and do the coding there, and when you come back to here, it's gonna say, hey, this other project was saved over here, it needs to be updated. You click yes, and vice versa. If you update something in Visual Studio or you update something in Blend, they communicate back and forth with each other really well. So that works out just fine. So once we come in here, you'll notice a few things that look the same, a few things that look different. But let's just go through some of the different menus. You can go through the file, new, all this stuff is going to look very, very similar. We're going to go through some of these today. But let's go through some of the windows. And so we can come in here. Oh, here's Solution Explorer. So we click on that. Here's our Solution Explorer over here. You'll notice that you can drag these things out if I want to, just like I can, with the other type things, the other windows that I've been working with in Visual Studio. So here's Properties, here's Resources. So if you say View Properties Windows, you'll notice that I come over here, and sure enough, it's just I can arrange it by category, I can arrange it by name, however you want to do it, just like Visual Studio. So this is all going to look really similar other than this black background. So that's the Properties window. There's also this Resources window, and so we're going to be talking a lot about resources and styles today. And so this is where you can get a list of all the resources, which are styles and templates and those things that are just sort of saved away in your application. And again, this will make a little more sense later on. We can also look at what's called the Assets window. So this is basically like your toolbox. And so the way Blend works is that you can not only select controls here, but they've also got a way to drag and drop styles, or what are called behaviors, on how you want things to look. They've got some shapes you can drag and drop. They've even got effects that you can drag on, so you can get a blur effect. So let's say you had a button and you want a blur effect on it, you can drag and drop that onto it. Ripple effects, magnifying. So kind of play with these, and you can drag and drop these little effects right onto your controls. For the most part, we won't even need to use this. We'll actually just use this little shortcut menu right here. And so as you go down here, just right click on these items. So for instance, this one right here, I can right click on it and you can see text blocked. So these are kind of the main controls. Right click on this one, you can see grid and everything like that. Here's the ones with buttons. So if I click checkbox, you can see that it's now set to checkbox, and then I can just drag and do it over I want over here. And so to get back to your cursor now, you can click here. So that's my normal cursor. Again, here's a magnifying glass. Here's a hand to drag things around. And so again, this is sort of just like a miniaturized version of your toolbox, which we'll be using a lot today. If we come up here, there's also this objects and timelines window. And so this is used so it actually gives you a breakdown of all the objects, all of your user interface objects that we're going to drag and drop over here. So again, if I come here, let's say I select a button and I draw a button on here, you can see that within the window there's a grid and then there's a button. So it's a nice easy way that you can see this visual tree here and selecting all of the elements within it. Now also it's called objects and timeline. And so what we're going to do here later on is I'm going to show you how to create animations via timelines and using what are called storyboards. So you can kind of see no storyboard open here. So we're going to add a storyboard, and that a storyboard is just like you would think of it like in a movie. You're storyboarding out some sort of animation. And so that's what this window here is going to help us do. We can also take a look at the triggers window, and so we'll be using this a little bit also, to where a trigger is just kind of writing C# code within your WPF, so you can trigger off a button click and then have an animation run, or on your window load have an animation run, or do something. You can trigger off some sort of event and you're telling it just to basically run some other WPF code. It's just a nice way of being able to write code within WPF essentially. Last window I want to talk about is this data window. And so this data window, what's nice about it, and I'm going to actually drag it over here, I like it better here, is let's say you're a designer and you don't want to have to wait for your developer to connect to write all the plumbing and all that code to connect to a database, be able to fill up a bunch of classes, pull data back, and then get that data to you, and all this structure. So what you can do is with this data tab is you can just right within the project with a few simple clicks, you can build a collection, right? Some sort of list that is filled up with objects which have properties in it. And then just right here it just fills up whatever data type you want with some random strings and integers and pictures, and then you can use that as generated data to then create your data templates. And so we'll take a look at that later on. So let's go ahead now and let's just start off with a button. So I've got a button here, and you'll notice if I come over here to my properties, this is going to look fairly similar to everything we've seen before, where I can come in here and I want a gradient brush, and then I can click on this color, or I can make it a little bit lighter. I can drag these tab stops, so I can change my tab stops to make the gradient lighter or darker, the different angles. I can do these little radiant ones. You can do anything you want as far as visually. It's going to be very similar to everything we've seen in Visual Studio. So let's talk about styles now. So styles are a really important concept to understand in WPF. So just like I've kind of hammered home that you never want your business logic behind the UI, you always want to abstract that out, and so you always want this sort of very plain user interface that has very little code behind except for the code that should update the user interface. Then all of your complex logic should be in these separate classes. Well, exactly the same can be applied to your user interface, where here on the user interface you should have as little hard-coded properties as possible in your Zamel. You want all of this stuff actually defined in what's called a style, and this is equivalent of a style sheet in HTML. Because what you really want to have happen is this exact same look and feel amongst all of your windows throughout your entire application. So you want all of your buttons to look exactly the same. You'll have the same gradients, the same look and feel, beveled edges, whatever you've done. Same thing with text boxes and the same fonts throughout your application. And so what you would generally do is you would figure out an overall theme for your application by writing different styles. So what you could do is you can create a style for a button, for instance, like let's say this is the way we want our button to look with this particular size fonts, and how rounded corners we want and how large we want it to be. This is our generate report button, something like that. And we could have like a stop a stop report button, or cancel report, whatever. And an exit application button, we can have a go back button. And so we'd have some style them all, but all of the Zamel that's defined to make it look this way, you'd pull that out and put it into what's called a style. And it's just like a style sheet. And so you can put the styles local to a given window, or you can put them in your app.zamel file and make them global to your entire application. And so then once you've put all of that styling in one of your app.zamel, or what's called a resource dictionary, we'll talk about that in a second, Then what you can do is you can come into your application, you can just apply that style to all of your buttons. So then let's say you present your user interface to your customer and they say, you know what, we really like this button to have more of our, our logo colors, and so you need to change this more to a blue than a red. Now you've used this button 50 different places, with this background color. However, you put the look and feel of it in a style. So that means you go to your style, update it in one place, and it's going to update all 50 buttons. So it's really important that you use styles and you think ahead when you're using these sort of things. So what we can do is let's drag our button on here, and again I change the background color. We can come down, here's the text, maybe we want to make it bold, and we want to make it 18 point, whatever. And so this is how we want all of our buttons to look now. So what we can do is we can come in and we can say, okay, let's click on our button. Let's come up to this format up here. And we can say edit style, edit a copy. And so what we're saying by this is that, remember, all UI controls in WPF are what are called lookless. So there is no user interface to them. The only reason they have this sort of look and feel to them is because Microsoft has applied a default style to a button. So they created it lookless, then they created the style for a button, the default style of what they thought a button should look like. And it just is automatically applied to the button. And so what we can do is we can say edit style, edit a copy. And so what we're going to do is we're going to edit a copy of the default style of the button. That way we don't have to start from scratch on our style. We'll show you what it actually looks like in a second. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to say create style from resource. And we're going to call it button style 1. Fine. Right now we're going to keep it local to this document or this window, and later on we're going to make it global in the application. So I'm going to click OK, and so what it's done now is it's actually taken us into this sort of different mode where we're now actually editing the style of this button. If I come over here to my objects and timeline, you can see it's actually telling me, hey, you're in this button style 1. You're not actually working with the window anymore. You're now focusing on the style. And so now what you can do is now I'm in button style mode, so I can actually come in here and I can modify everything I want for this button. And all I'm doing now is I'm updating that style. So for instance, I didn't really mean to make this 18. It actually should be 16. I should make it italics. Whatever. You just change all the different things throughout here. It actually should be, again, that company logo. Should be something like this. Let's make it a little bit lighter so it's easier to see. And so now we're good. We've created our style. And so what we can do now is we can apply that style to other buttons. So let's go ahead and click this little, it's kind of again, you just sort of learn this. You click this to return scope to the window. So when I click that, you notice I've jumped back out to my window. Now I'm no longer editing that style. Now down here you can see we've got a design workspace and we've got our Zamel workspace, just like in Visual Studio. So let's go to the Zamel and take a look at what it actually did for us. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Now if you scroll down to the bottom, here's that button, and everything should be just like we've seen before. Now I scroll all the way to the right, you can see that what I've done is I've created a style called button 1, and I've linked up this button 1 style to the style of the button. So let's take a look at the style we just created. So if I scroll back to the top here, you can see inside the Windows.Resources we created these new styles. Now here's the actual style. Now you'll notice that there's all this extra style stuff up here. They define solid color brushes, and there's the style down here. I'm going to close this one down just for a second so we can take a look at everything up here. So here's the thing. With a button style, there's a lot of things that have been defined sort of at a global level just even to be used within the button style. So remember, a resource can be anything you want. So for instance, a resource can be a brush, or in this case a solid color brush that has this color background. And you can see as I scroll through here, these are the different solid color brushes, and you can actually kind of see the color over here that they define. And so these are going to be individual pieces that are actually applied down here inside the style. So for instance, button disabled, button pressed, mouse over. So you can see they've defined all kinds of resources just for the color of brush. So if you ever want to change, the mouse over, for instance, you could just change this one color, and as the mouse hovers over the button, it would change it. Now, okay, so I've also got this focus. So this is the style that's going to get applied when focus has been applied to the button. And so all of this has been generated in order so that we can actually use it within the actual style. So if we open that up, it's going to actually use all of these resources inside our style. And so you'll notice by the name it's called button one style, and it says, oh, the target is of type button. And again, you just sort of have to get used to this syntax. And most of the time you're not going to be writing it by hand. I don't even have this syntax exactly memorized because I would do it in some sort of Blend Studio. Now what you can do inside your styles is you can create what are called setters. And so what's nice about this is it just says, okay, set this property, here's the value to set it to. Now on this one, you can notice that it's saying set it to focus visual. So if you came up here, there's going to be a style called focus visual. Sure enough, here it is. And so you can see that inside this style, it's using this resource, which just happens to be another style. So this style is applying another style to this property. So you can see this is everything that Microsoft said is what makes up a button. So we can go through, we can take a look at, hey, what's the border brush, what's the border thickness, all of this stuff. And not only that, within a style, there's also a property called template. And so a template is actually what makes up a button. It's actually the individual objects, the borders, and the actual content presenter, and all of these things that actually make up the controls within the button. So not just the visual elements, but the actual controls. So you'll notice it has a border in here, and it has a content presenter. So a button is actually made up of sub-elements, and you can actually visually change those. And we're going to take a look at templates in just a second. So for right now, we're just going to focus on the style, the overall style, the look and feel of it. So this is everything that Blend created for us. So we've come back to our button. We're now back in our window mode. Let's go ahead now and drag another button on here. And we're like, oh, dang, what I actually wanted here was to have this button look exactly the same. So I can right-click on it, say Edit Template, apply resource, and sure enough, there's button style 1. I click that, and now you can see both buttons look exactly the same. Interesting that it didn't pass over. I wonder if I set the properties at the different level. So normally it'll make them give, I must have changed the font at a different level. I've done something to screw it up. So let's do this. So here's my button. I can right click on it, edit template, apply resource, button style 1. Then you can see I can come in here, drag another button. Now I can also apply this style. So that's going to make all of your buttons look exactly the same. Now what you can also do now is I can click on this and I can override certain properties, which I think was the mistake I just made before, where I can come in here, I can say, you know what, I really don't want that italic. What I actually want is this font to be like 22. And so you can see then you can sort of override the style that's being applied to it. And also anytime you see these little marks here that come up in blue, these little boxes, that means that these properties are being applied via the style. So that's what that's showing you there. So now let's say, okay, you know what, this actually seems kind of error prone, doesn't it? That every time I take a button and I drag it on here, every single developer, every time they use a button, has to right click and say apply resource. What happens if they forget? Which they will, right? There's a 100% chance that people are going to fail to remember to do this to every single button and text box and label, to apply the correct style to all of these elements. And so what you can do is you can come into your Zamel, and right here on this key, all you have to do is just delete the key here. And so you get rid of the name of this style and save it. And what that's saying is I automatically want this style applied to all buttons. So this is really the way you would generally want to create it. So this would sort of be like your default style for all buttons. However, then you would want specific styles, maybe for an alert button or a stop button that you could then specifically right click on and apply. So now when I come over here, you'll notice that they're automatically, even though down here in my XAML, you'll notice that there's nothing being set on these. So these ones, I had set from before, but I can delete these off. And even with deleting those off, you can see that they all still have that style applied. And again, you could create other styles, and then for this button, you could come in here to edit template, apply style, and apply that different style that you created. But this is a nice way that all styles get the exact same, or all buttons get the exact same style applied to them. So now what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to delete this, just kind of clean up this code a little bit. just to make it easier to work with. I'm also going to go ahead and just delete everything in here just to keep things cleaner. So now let's come back and let's talk about templates. So let's just go ahead and use a button again because they're really easy to work with. And so you'll notice that this button, when you drag it up here and it says, okay, this is a button type, right? It's all self-contained. However, just as we kind of saw a second ago, that not only is this button made up of different styles that talk about that set this font and the background color and all those things, it's actually made up of two sub controls you don't really think about, which is the content presenter and this like border or grid. So if we want our button to look completely different, we can make it look like anything we want. So all we have to do is right click on it, say edit template now, edit a copy. So now we're going to be modifying it. Now remember that template was still inside of a style, so it's still going to create a style for us, and we're going to be modifying the template within that style. So go ahead and just click OK. And you notice now we're modifying the button template here. And sure enough, here's the border and here's the content presenter. So you can change this button to look any way you feel. You can delete the content presenter, you can delete the button, you can make this look like a, maybe a weight scale. Like, maybe you're creating an application to track people's, steps, and so they can click this button and they can, looks like a, weight scale that takes their weight, and they track their weight, so they click this button and they enter in, I weigh 200 pounds or something of that nature. So you make the button look more visually appealing to what it's going to actually perform. So now we're going to come into the Zamel here now of our actual control template. So remember, we're editing our template, and we can see here's the control template that's setting this property, and we can see here's that border and here's that content presenter. So what I'm actually going to do is close all this down so we don't have to worry about these triggers, and I'm going to delete out this border and the control templates so that I've now deleted everything that actually makes up that button. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to paste in some code so I don't screw up typing it in. And so all I'm now saying is that what makes up a button is a grid that has an ellipse in it and has a content presenter in it. And so I've just made this ellipse red, and so we come back to my design and you can see this is now what a button is. Looks completely different, right? And again, I could make this look like, a piece of food. Maybe you could make it look like a banana that the user is entering in, what fruit they ate that day, or whatever it possibly is. You can make this button look like exactly like you want. And so we can save that. We can exit out of our button template. Let's drag another button on here, and we want this button to look exactly like this one. So we right click on here, edit template, apply resource, button style 1. Now they look exactly the same. When I click on this, you can see as far as it is at this level, it's just a button. So what do buttons have? Well, I can come up to my lightning bolt and look, there's the click events, here's everything else, so I can double click the click event. Now here's the in blend sort of editor, and it's just fine for writing code. And so if you need some simple code, I would just say write it in here. However, I would generally write code in Visual Studio unless it's just something really quick and easy. Then I would write it within Blend. So that's how templates work. And again, you just really need to think through everything that you're doing, that you're creating, so that you can sort of plan ahead in your code. So with styles and templates, it's one of the things you need to architect out when you're very first creating your application, what all your buttons and your labels are going to look like, the colors you're going to have applied to them, the fonts, all those sort of things. So again, let's take a look at the next thing we can do within Blend. I just find it easier if I just delete everything out here so we don't mess anything up. Go back to the design. So now what I'm actually going to do is show you a different way that you can create a button. So I'm going to come up here, and there's these different, you can see there's eyedroppers, here's different, there's a gradient tool, and this next one down here is a pen and pencil. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab and draw a pencil, or use a pencil to draw a cloud. And so let's say, we're creating some game and it has a cloud in it, or we want a cloud as a button, for instance. And so I can come in here, you can see what it did was it actually created what's called a path to create this, little shape. And so at this time, all this object is a path, and the path just defines just points within this path. And you can see all it does is draws a whole bunch of points that it connects together, and then you can fill it up with different things. So I can click on this background, I can change its color to blue or whatever else I want. But it's just created a path. What I really want here is a button. So now what I can do is I can come up here and I can click Tools, and then I can click the button that, or the thing that says Make into Control. So I click that, and it says, hey, what do you want to turn it into? Well, I want to turn it into a button. Go ahead and click OK, and now you'll notice when I click on this, you can see that I'm inside this button style, which is fine. But now when I exit out of this, you can see that this whole object here, has now been converted into a button. Well, how did it do that? Well, what it did is here's this button at the bottom, and you notice all it did, it says, okay, it applied a style called button style 1, which it created for me. Then inside that style, inside the template, you can see that for the template, all it did was it created a grid with a path in it, which was exactly that same path we just looked at, and it also added in a content presenter for us. So all they did was modify the control template and put that original path into it, and they also added a content presenter so that we could get this little button text here so that we could modify the content of it. So just another way that you can create a button and again make it look how you want it to look. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that. Come up here, delete these. Come back to our design. So now what we want to work with is some animations. And we do animations through what are called storyboards. So let's go ahead and animate a button. It's just easy enough to work with a button. So let's drag a button on here. Let's go ahead and name the button. So we'll call it Command My Button. And so what we want to do is when we click this button, we want it to have some animation associated with it. So that's where triggers are going to come in handy. So if we can come up here to our triggers, so we can do View Triggers window, we're saying, hey, when you click this button, we want to run a storyboard. And the storyboard defines for us what's actually going to take place in this animation. So I'm going to come in here and you see, hey, create a trigger on Windows loaded. That's not really what I wanted. What I wanted was when this button gets clicked, is raised, then I click this and it says, okay, I'm going to add a new action. Hey, no storyboard exists. Click OK. So now what it's done is it's put me in what's called animation mode. And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take this and I'm going to drag it down below here. That's just going to be much easier to work with when you want to animate things. So I'm going to drag this down a little bit. Just kidding. Apparently it's not going to drag down. It's just going to ignore me. Oh well. So now what we can do is we can now animate our button throughout here. And so you'll notice that here's this button and here's a timeline for what we can do. So I can drag this out if I want. You can see I can record what are called keyframes. So here's our initial keyframe that's going to start our thing. Say at half a second out, what we want to do is I'm going to I'm going to rotate this just a little bit. And at 1 second, I'm going to rotate it back a little bit too far. And then out here, we're going to rotate it all the way around. And then a little bit later out, we're going to make it grow really large. And also, by the way, transition to this color. And then, 3 seconds out, it's going to rotate back around and then shrink back like this. So now I can click play, and it's actually going to play that animation for us. And you can see along the way here, it actually created these little points in time. And you can see over here what it actually, the type of animation that it applied at these various levels. And so I can actually drag here and I can see as the animation is going if I want. Again, I can start here, I can take a look at it, and I can also click on the storyboard right here to get its property. So for instance, I can click auto reverse so that when I play it, it comes out and then it automatically reverses for me, so it just goes right back to its original state. So again, you can do anything you want as far as adding to this storyboard. And so that's how you know it's in storyboard mode or record mode when it's got this up here. So let's now go ahead and take a look at the Zamel. So when we come into the Zamel here, I'm going to go ahead and get this out of the way. Inside the Zamel, it created this storyboard. And you can see the key is called on click. And so if I were to minimize this storyboard, you can see it actually created this other little tag in my window called triggers. And so this is how triggers are defined. So it says I'm defining an event trigger, and that is associated with a button-based click, and this is the button that we're looking at for that. When you click this button, this is what I want to have happen. It just says run this storyboard on click. And again, I couldn't even write this, syntax from memory because you just write it, so you don't write it very often, and I always use a tool like Blend to write it for me. So you open up the storyboard, and you can see now what it does inside of a storyboard is it creates various objects. Now all of this could be written in C sharp, so you could do this all behind the scenes in C sharp if you wanted to. And sometimes with animations, that's actually what I've done. If you need to build them dynamically based on some input or some values from the database, then I actually will mock up sort of an animation in my UI like this. And then what I do is I mimic it in C sharp. So I say to myself, okay, I know to create this animation that I want in C sharp, I'm going to have to instantiate this class. And then I'm going to have to add these easing double keyframe objects to it. And then within those objects, I'm going to have to add, I'm going to have to set these properties. And so it's just a way that you can take a look and see how you actually write the C sharp code out by looking and analyzing this Zamel. And so you can see in order to create that storyboard animations, first they're creating a double animation using keyframes. So it's a double, you're setting a double value here. And these just happen to be the target properties here. So you can see the render transform, you're setting some children and then angles. And you can see this is the target name, which is always going to be that button. And it says, at these certain times, and you can see at different times, it's going to set the value of these properties at these times. And as we scroll down here, you can see double animation, double animation, double animation. Here's that color animation now. So you can see we're actually setting the background color, and we're setting it, at these times to these values. And so again, just try to imagine trying to have to write this by hand. And again, this is where, Blend really comes in handy. And what you can also do is save all these storyboards away to like your app.zamel file, and then you can call these storyboards. You can tell them to actually run, in your C sharp code if you wanted to. It doesn't have to be done just with triggers. So let's come back here. Let's go ahead and get rid of this, so we're not in record mode anymore. And so now let's go ahead and look at what's called property binding. So I'm going to click this down. Let's get rid of this storyboard here so it doesn't freak out on us. Come back to our design. So if you remember from a previous lecture, we talked about how in WPF you can bind different objects together, and we had a list box, and it bound the elements within it. And so what we're going to do is we're going to do some of sort of that same binding where we had this list box that was bound to these text blocks and things like that, and you clicked on the item in the list box and it changed the background colors or the text of your text blocks. Well, now let's show you how to do that just within Blend itself. So again, if you forget that syntax, sometimes you can use Blend to sort of help you with how to do that. So the first thing we're going to come over here to do is we're going to take a list box, and I'm going to drag it on here. And so you can see here's this list box, and we'll call this my list box. Now within this list box, I'm going to right click on it, and I'm going to say add list box item. Okay, great. Here's my list box item. So I can come down here and you can see all the different properties now for that particular list box item. And so what we want to do now is we're going to change this content to red because we want those colors. Do add list box item. Come over here to the content. Let's change this to green. Let's do one more. Add list box item. Let's change this to yellow. So now we've basically set up our original text box, or our list box. Now let's go ahead and add a text box. So let's come in here to text box. Let's drag this right here. And so now we've created ourselves a text box, and now remember we're going to try to bind this text box's content and its background color to whatever was selected up here. So let's set our text box now. And over here on the content, or sorry, the text property, I'm going to scroll down here on the text box. You can click this little button or this little box over here. And when I click that, you can select bind to element. And so what I'm saying here, this is sort of a wizard on how you can actually bind this to another element. And so I'm going to just now click on my list box. And you can see it's asking me, hey, what property do I want to bind to? And so I come in here and I say, okay, I'm going to actually set this to selected item. And so there's my selected item. And you can see I can drop it down here, and these should look familiar to you, right, on the property changed. Well, let's go ahead and just set it to two-way. Okay, that happened to be by default. And then update source when we don't want the default, we actually want property change. So as we type, it gets updated. So then we can go ahead and click OK. And so that actually did it for us, all within, some sort of wizard. Now, it almost got us all the way there, but if we come to our text box, we needed to change it just a little bit further. And so under here where it says, selected item, the binding to the selected item, but we actually want to select the item.content. So it almost got us all the way there, just not quite. Because we don't want to bind to the selected items, we want to bind to the selected items content. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go to this text box, but we're going to go to its background property. Because remember, we also want to bind to that. So here's our background property. So now I can click this. And what we're going to do now is we're going to do create a data binding. So we're going to, rather than that bind element, we're going to do it the same sort of thing, but we're going to use this, what's called create data binding. And so that's going to come up with this little page here. And so now what I can do is I can do under binding type, we're going to do element name. And so it's basically saying, hey, what element do you want it to be bound to? And we're going to actually bind it to our list box. And then within our list box, we're going to select to our, let's get rid of this here. This will give us all of them. And so now we're going to do our selected item again. So we say selected item. Go ahead and click OK. Now we come back to our Zamel, and we'll see the same thing. We actually need to say selected item dot content. We can save that. Come back to our design. I can hit F5. It's going to run our application, and hopefully it works just like it did before. And sure enough, there we go. I can change this something to brown. Oh, I didn't change it on property on this particular one. But you can see it works just like our other example. But again, we did it through Blend. We didn't have to figure out all the syntax that we had to add. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this now. Delete Zamel. Make sure there's nothing that's going to get in the way. So the next thing we want to talk about is our data tab. So we click on view, click on data window, and again, this is the tab that a designer can use now to generate fake data. So we're going to come in here, and then we're going to say, okay, what we really want to do now is in this document, we're going to be able to create some sample data, or we're going to be able to create a data source. And so what we want to do is, first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a data sample, and we're just going to create a new data sample, and we're just going to do it, we're going to call it sample data source. It actually creates some files within our project. That's fine. We don't really care. We're just a designer. And so now what we can do is we can start now playing with this data. And so what it's done for us is it's created this data source. And inside that data source, it created a collection. So this is just a list, just some sort of binding list or whatever, binding collection. And it has two properties within it. And so what you'll notice is this first property, I can click down here and it says, oh, it's a string type. The second property is of type Boolean, so it's going to hold random true or false values. I can also come in here and I can add a new simple property if I want to, or I can add a whole new collection. But let's just do a simple property. So let's click simple property called property 3. We can call this, name if we want to, and we could set this to a string, or maybe we could set it to image as our property name. And then over here on the type, instead of string, maybe what we want it to do is to be an image. And so this will actually be a string, this will be a Boolean, and this will be an image for our type. Now if I take my collection and actually drag it over here to my window, you can see what it did was it actually created for me this list box. Let me go objects and timelines again, add this back over here. And so you can see it created a list box for me. So now with this list box, I could now edit the data template associated with this, and I could actually modify how these things look. So you'll notice now I could do edit template, edit a copy, and now when I edit a copy of this, you can see what I'm actually doing now is I'm editing, this template for it, and so I can then create that, and then I can apply this template now to other list box on how I want this, look and feel to come across. So I could then, modify the properties for it. So for instance, I could change, how I wanted this, where I wanted these layouts to be, etc., etc., so that you could then end up applying that, to all of your list boxes. And so then you could create that data template from there and apply it to other list boxes and make it look that way. So that's the way that you can do that with your data here. And so it's just a nice way that you can drag and drop and already have things right within here. You've got your list box. Again, I could create a data template from this or an item template from this and then be able to apply that item template to other list boxes, but I could just sort of modify it all right here within Visual Studio, which is really nice to be able to do. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that now so we can move on. Let's just scroll up here to my Windows resources. Go ahead and save that. So now what we can do is show you another way that we can create a little simple animation. So what I'm going to do on here is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to draw an ellipse. And now within this ellipse, let's go ahead and get back to our properties window. We'll just call this ellipse. Next we can actually draw a path on here. So let's come over to our pencil here and let's kind of do like a little roller coaster path. Now I'm going to get rid of this fill here so that it actually doesn't have any background associated with it. And so now we can click on our path, click Format, and we can actually say, okay, now what we really want to do with this is to create a path in order to follow a motion. And so we can create a motion path. Then what we're going to say is, okay, what I really want to do, choose the object you want to move along the motion path. So we're going to say my ellipse, click OK. And so what it's actually done now when I click play is you can see it created this what's called a motion path. So if I wanted to, I could make this path invisible, but it's just a way that you can create another animation, but it adds a little bit of complexity here so you can now follow what's called a motion path. So just kind of a neat way to be able to create an animation there. So let's go ahead and get rid of this. And let's give you some help now for your final project. So I'm going to go ahead and just delete all of, let's get rid of this. Let's get rid of Windows.triggers. Let's get rid of all this stuff. And all of this, just to get everything cleaned up. So now, remember when we were talking about data or templates and styles? Now imagine you're creating a professional application and now your job is to style buttons, labels, text boxes, canvas, wrap panels, text blocks, rich text box, password boxes, check boxes, combo boxes, etc., etc., etc. You'd have to manually style every single control to use the appropriate colors. Now that is so time consuming and is going to cost so much money. So basically you're paying a developer anywhere from $100 to $200 an hour after you pay them their salary and their benefits and their 401k, and how much it costs to, for the building costs and, computers and everything else. It's very expensive to pay for this engineer's time. And so you have to think about this. If you're going to either pay someone the months and months, the 6 months it's going to take to write styles for every single control, or does it make more sense to pay $200 and just buy one off the internet that will style your entire application with every single control, or you can actually get free ones from Microsoft. And that's what I'm going to show you how to do here. Now, what I've done in that files for students that I've given you is that there's actually in here this miscellaneous code and other files, and there's this WPF themes. And inside this WPF themes, there's all these Zamel files, and this is what I downloaded from a place called CodePlex. And so CodePlex is a place I highly recommend you get used to. And so in CodePlex, I downloaded these styles, these WPF themes. And so what Microsoft did was it created what are called resource dictionaries. And so if I actually open these with Notepad, what you'll notice that it did is that it could put all of these resources. So we looked at resources before, right? We have solid color brushes, we have styles, all these things, and they put them all inside what's called a resource dictionary. So a resource dictionary is just a way to organize a whole lot of resources. And you can see that inside this file is a whole lot of styles and templates. So you can see here's how we can style a tab item of a tab control. We can scroll down a little bit further, and here's another style, and target type is a thumb control. We can scroll down further, and if we want, here's the style for a radio button and everything that makes up a radio button. And so you can see it's quite complex and time consuming to create this. And so what these are, these resource dictionaries, are essentially themes that you can apply to your application. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to come over here, and so I've downloaded these themes. Let's get rid of this. And so now in my project, I'm going to right click and say add an existing item. And I'm going to go to my desktop, go to the class, and I'm going to come into those themes. I have to do all files. And let's do this blue theme here. I'm going to double click it, and that's going to add that into my project right here. And so now what I want to do is I want to define or reference this resource inside my app.xaml file, but let's say I don't remember exactly how this syntax works. I can come into this resource window, I can right click on my app.xaml file and say link to resource dictionary, and sure enough it knows now about this blue theme. I can click on it, and what this did was inside my app.xaml file, it added these lines of code here. And so ignore the sample data. This created for us when we're creating that data in that collection. And so what it's saying is inside of our resource dictionary, we're going to create a merge dictionaries. What that means is that you can have as many resource dictionaries as you want. So I could add multiple ones to my project if I wanted to, and we'll do that in just a second. And so all it did was it says at a global level, add this resource dictionary to our project. And so now if I come over here to my main window, and sure enough, if I come in here, let's say I drag, let's do a button, you can see that it applied that blue, style to all of my controls. So no matter what I add on here, and I add on, list box items, so all my controls now are going to have these sort of defaults to them. Maybe something like a radio button, so that when I run this, you can see that this has a little yellow, a little kind of green check box. I got my list box item. You can see when I highlight these, see how they turn yellow. I click it and it kind of clicks down in orange. Okay, let's say this isn't the one that I liked. So let's right click, do add an existing item, but now let's do shiny red. So now we've added shiny red. So if we come into our app.xaml, I can come over here to my resources, app.xaml, right click, link to resource dictionary, shiny red, and you can see just by doing that it automatically changed everything, the entire theme of every application or every window. And so now you can see it completely changed the look and feel of every single control. But these are going to look a lot more professional, and they're all going to be coherent throughout all your different windows in your application. And again, all it did was it just added and modified your resource dictionaries over here, and that's really all it did. So it's just kind of a nice way that really quickly that you can change the entire theme of your application. Now on your final group project, this is one of the things I say you have to do is use, styles and themes for it. So you could do this with just one line of code, add one of these and make your app look a lot more professional. So again, expression blend is used by designers in order to make an application look more professional. It just gives you a lot more tools in order to modify all of the visual elements here.